When my husband died, he left me a set of keys I didn't recognize. One of them opened a storage unit in Mississauga I had never heard of. Inside was a locked metal cabinet. Taped to the front was an envelope with my name on it and a combination written in his handwriting. What was inside changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Good afternoon, dear listeners. I'm Vivian, and I'm glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, welcome. If you've been with me for a while, you know that I read slowly, and I mean every word. Please subscribe if you haven't, and leave me a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. It means more to me than you might think. My husband, Raymond, died on a Thursday in November. A stroke, sudden, the kind that gives no warning and no time to say anything that matters. He was 59 years old and had been, by every measure I could see, a steady and careful man. He worked in commercial property management. He read the newspaper every morning at the kitchen table in our house in Oakville, Ontario. He took the recycling out without being asked. He remembered my mother's birthday and called her on it every single year until she passed. We had been married for 27 years, and I had believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has shared a bed and a mortgage and 1,000 ordinary dinners with another person, that I knew him. I was 54 years old when he died. I had spent most of my working life as an office administrator at a mid-sized accounting firm in Burlington. I was organized. I was thorough. I was not the kind of woman who missed things, or so I had believed. The keys turned up 6 weeks after the funeral, in the pocket of a jacket I was sorting to donate, a small ring with 3 keys, one for a deadbolt, one a padlock key, and one I didn't recognize the shape of. No label, no note. Just the keys, cold in my palm, while the November light came through the bedroom window, and I stood there trying to remember if I had ever seen them before. I told myself there was an ordinary explanation. Raymond had properties he managed for clients. He had keys to things that were not ours. I put the ring on the counter and went back to folding. It was my daughter Simone who found the storage unit. Simone Beaumont Cheng, my eldest, 31 years old, a logistics coordinator from Hamilton who approaches problems the way a terrier approaches a fence post. She had come to help me sort through Raymond's desk, and while I handled the paper files, she went through his email archive, which I had access to as his spouse, and which neither of us had thought to look at before. She found a monthly billing notification from a storage company in Mississauga, $62 a month, billed to an account in Raymond's name. The earliest charge in the archive was from 4 years ago. We looked at each other across his desk. "Did you know about this?" she said. I did not know about this. The drive to Mississauga took 40 minutes. I did not bring Simone. She had offered, and I could see in her face that she wanted to come, that she had already begun assembling the shape of what this might be. But I needed to go alone. There is a particular kind of not knowing that you want to preserve as long as possible, because on the other side of it is something you cannot unsee. I wanted those 40 minutes. The storage facility was on a commercial strip off the 401, the kind of place that exists in every Canadian city without anyone quite noticing it. Self-storage, climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled like cardboard, and the specific loneliness of things people can't quite bring themselves to throw away. I gave Raymond's name at the front desk. The young man checked his records and confirmed that I, as the named estate contact, had access. I signed a form and he handed me a unit number. Unit 114 was at the end of the second corridor. The deadbolt key on Raymond's ring fit perfectly. Inside was a metal filing cabinet, gray, 4 drawers, the kind you'd see in any office. a padlock on the top drawer. The second key fit that, and on top of the cabinet, taped with a single piece of clear tape, a white envelope with my name written on it in Raymond's handwriting. Just my first name, in the careful printing he used for important things. I had not planned to open it there, in that storage unit under fluorescent lights, with the hum of the climate system around me and the smell of cold metal in the air. But I did. I sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinet and I opened the letter. It was 2 pages. Raymond was not a man who used many words. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly, without ornamentation, which made what he had written worse rather than better, because there was nowhere to hide inside it. He had been skimming money from a client, a property management client he had held for over a decade, an elderly woman in Burlington named Constance Yip. Over 6 years, he had been submitting inflated invoices for maintenance work that either hadn't been done or had been done at a fraction of the cost. The overcharges ran to just over $310,000 in total. He had kept the records in the filing cabinet because, he wrote, he had always intended to pay it back. He had not paid it back. There was more. Raymond had a business partner, a man named Glenn Sato, who had incorporated a property management holding company with Raymond 8 years ago. Glenn had known about the billing irregularities. More than known, Glenn had participated in structuring them. When Raymond, 3 months before his death, had told Glenn he wanted to stop and disclose and find a way to make Constance Yip whole, Glenn had refused. He had reminded Raymond that he had his own name on the relevant invoices, and that any disclosure would expose them both equally. The third key, Raymond wrote, opened a lockbox inside the second drawer. In it was everything: 6 years of invoices, the real ones and the inflated ones, a ledger he had kept by hand, printed email correspondence between him and Glenn, and a personal letter, signed and notarized, describing the arrangement in full and identifying Glenn as the originator of the scheme. Raymond had written his letter to me in October. He died in November. He had not told me. He had not gone to a lawyer. He had written a letter and left it on top of a filing cabinet in Mississauga, and waited for something, I suppose, that had not come. I sat on that floor for a long time. The drive home was the longest 40 minutes I can remember. I did not cry. I am not sure I was capable of crying at that point. What I felt instead was a flatness, a kind of interior silence, the way a room sounds after a very loud noise has stopped. 27 years. I kept turning the number over. 27 years, and there had been a version of my husband I had never known. Not a secret family, not a second life in the cinematic sense. Something smaller, and in some ways worse. A quiet, incremental dishonesty that had been unfolding in the background of our ordinary life for 6 years while we ate dinner and watched television and talked about whether to repaint the front hallway. I want to be honest about something. My first feeling was not outrage on behalf of Constance Yip, though that came. My first feeling was humiliation, that I had not known, that I had believed so completely in a version of my husband that had not been entirely true. That feeling, I've come to understand, is very common among people who discover deception in long marriages, and it is worth naming because it sits on top of the real injury and makes it harder to think clearly. I told Simone that evening. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter on the counter, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which required visible effort. When I finished, she said very quietly, "What are you going to do?" I didn't know yet, but I was already starting to think about it in the disciplined way that comes from decades of organizing other people's complicated problems. I got a yellow notepad and I started writing down what I knew. The first thing I knew was that Constance Yip was owed money, not by Raymond's estate, necessarily, though that was possible, but by someone. The second thing I knew was that Glenn Sato knew, and that Glenn was still running a property management company in the GTA, presumably still billing clients, presumably still in the same business. The third thing I knew was that I had a filing cabinet full of documents that Raymond had never shown anyone. I spent 2 days reading everything in that cabinet. I am an office administrator. I have spent 30 years managing records. And what Raymond had assembled was, despite everything, extraordinarily organized. The ledger was meticulous. The invoices were sorted by date. The email correspondence was printed in chronological order and paper-clipped. It was the filing system of a man who felt guilty and wanted someday for someone to be able to understand exactly what had happened. I drove back to the storage unit twice to photograph everything with my phone before I removed a single page. I didn't know why, exactly, except that I had the instinct of someone who has watched enough mismanaged files to know that original documents disappear. On the fourth day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Sandra Osei. A colleague at my firm had used her years ago in a complicated estate matter and had described her as the kind of lawyer who reads everything twice and bills you for both readings, but is worth it. Sandra's office was in a converted Victorian on James Street North in Hamilton, the kind of office that projects competence rather than expense. She was in her early 50s, efficient and precise, with the specific quality of attention that makes you feel, sitting across from her, that your problem is the only problem she is thinking about. I told her everything. She listened the way she presumably listened to everything, with a stillness that felt like active work. When I finished, she put down her pen. "You've brought the documents?" I had brought copies. She looked through them for several minutes. "The original invoices," she said, "along with the ledger and the emails, form a reasonably clear picture. The question is what you want to accomplish and who you want to go after." She explained the landscape. Raymond was dead, which complicated matters. His estate could be named in a civil claim, but a criminal referral against a deceased person went nowhere. Glenn Sato was a different matter. Glenn was alive. Glenn's business was active. And Glenn's name was on the emails and on several of the invoice submissions. "There's also Constance Yip," Sandra said. "She should be told. Depending on her circumstances and her wishes, she may want to pursue her own claim against the Sato business directly. How do I find her?" Raymond's should have her contact information. She was his client. She was. I found Constance Yip's address in Raymond's client records that same evening, a condominium in Burlington, one of the newer buildings near the lake. I wrote her a letter. I did not send it immediately. I kept it for 3 days, revising it, because I was aware that what I was sending into a stranger's life was not a minor disruption. I was telling an elderly woman that the man who had managed her property for over a decade had been systematically overcharging her for 6 years. I sent it on a Tuesday. I included a copy of Raymond's letter and a summary of the key documents. And I included my phone number and told her she was under no obligation to contact me. She called me the following morning. Her voice on the phone was steadier than I expected. She was 78 years old, and she had that particular quality of composure that sometimes comes with age, or with having already lived through difficult things. "I had noticed," she said, "over the past couple of years, that the maintenance costs seemed high. I mentioned it to Raymond once. He told me costs had gone up across the board. A pause. I believed him. I know how that feels, I told her. We met for coffee 2 days later, at a cafe near her building. Constance Yip was a small, upright woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that takes up more room than her physical size suggests. She brought her own copy of the summary I'd sent with annotations in the margins. She had already called her own lawyer. Her lawyer's name was Douglas Ferreira, a civil litigator in Oakville who handled financial fraud and estate disputes. Constance's daughter had recommended him. Douglas was in his mid-40s, direct without being aggressive, and within a week of receiving the documents, he had filed a civil claim against Glenn Sato's holding company for breach of fiduciary duty and unjust enrichment. Sandra and Douglas worked in parallel and occasionally together. Sandra helped me through the estate implications, whether Raymond's estate had any exposure, what my obligations were as his executor, how to handle the filing cabinet documents legally. Douglas managed Constance's claim directly against Glenn. I was not a party to that claim, but Constance had named me as a potential witness and had asked Sandra whether I would be willing to cooperate. I said yes immediately. Glenn Sato found out about the claim within 72 hours of the filing. I know this because his personal assistant called my home phone on a Wednesday evening. The assistant identified herself as calling on Mr. Sato's behalf and said that Mr. Sato was deeply concerned and would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with me directly, as there were aspects of the situation that she felt I might not have the full context for. I said I was sorry, but I had directed all communications through my lawyer, and I would need this call to go through her office. Then I hung up and called Sandra. Glenn himself called 2 days later. He did not identify himself as Glenn at first. He said, "Vivian, it's Glenn Sato. I don't know if you remember me." I remembered him clearly from the 2 or 3 company dinners I had attended with Raymond over the years. He had always been pleasant, in the specific way of someone who is very careful to be pleasant. He said he was deeply saddened by Raymond's passing, and he wanted me to know that Raymond had been his closest friend as well as his business partner. He said he understood. I had found some documents that were, he imagined, confusing to me, given that I hadn't been involved in the day-to-day complexities of property management. He said there was context he would very much like to share with me. I listened to him say these things. Then I said that I had a lawyer and he was welcome to call her office. He paused. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was still there, but it had shifted quality the way light shifts through glass. "Vivian, I want to make sure you understand the full picture before this goes any further. Raymond was not a simple man. There are things in those files that, out of context, could be misleading. I'd hate for his memory to be further complicated by documents that don't tell the whole story." Raymond's memory. I noticed the word "further." I noticed the implicit suggestion that my husband's legacy was something I should want to protect, and that Glenn was in a position to affect it. "Raymond's memory," I said, "is something I'll manage on my own, thank you. Please call Sandra Osie's office if you want to be in touch." I ended the call. I forwarded a detailed account to Sandra by email that evening, with exact wording I'd written down immediately afterward. She replied at 8 the next morning. "Good, don't speak to him again." Glenn's lawyers contacted Douglas with an opening offer 3 weeks after the claim was filed. The offer was structured as a voluntary restitution package from Glenn's holding company, $85,000 to Constance Yip, framed as a goodwill settlement, acknowledging that some billing irregularities may have occurred. The offer was accompanied by a proposed non-disclosure agreement, and a statement that the settlement did not constitute an admission of wrongdoing. Douglas called me to describe the offer. His voice had the controlled flatness of someone who finds something professionally infuriating and has trained himself not to say so directly. Constance's damages, by our calculations based on the ledger, are $310,000, he said. They're offering just over a quarter of that and asking for her silence. Constance, when Douglas called her, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ask them if they think I was born yesterday." Douglas declined the offer. Glenn escalated quickly after that. His lawyers filed a motion arguing that the ledger and personal letter Raymond had prepared were inadmissible, claiming they constituted a self-serving document by a deceased person, with no opportunity for cross-examination, and that any information I had provided to both lawyers had been obtained from estate documents improperly removed from a storage unit before probate was finalized. Sandra had anticipated this. She had advised me from the beginning to leave the original documents in the storage unit and work from photographs and certified copies only, precisely because this challenge was predictable. When Glenn's lawyers raised it, Sandra was able to demonstrate a clear chain of custody. I had photographed everything in place, brought only copies to her office, and the originals had been sealed under a court order obtained through the estate process. The motion failed. What I hadn't expected was Glenn's second approach. He came to my house on a Saturday morning in February, 3 months after the claim was filed. He didn't come alone. He brought his wife, Karen Sato, who I had met perhaps twice, and who had always seemed, in my limited experience of her, to be a warm and genuinely decent person. It was Karen who knocked. When I opened the door, Glenn was standing slightly behind her, holding a coffee carrier with 3 cups, the same performance in a different costume. Karen said she knew they were showing up unannounced, and she was sorry for that. But she felt that this had gone further than it needed to, and that she was hoping we could talk, woman to woman, about what Raymond had actually meant to them. I looked at the coffee. I looked at Karen. I felt something move through me. Not quite anger, but something that had been compressed for 3 months and was very ready to decompress. "Karen," I said, "I know that you might be here genuinely, and I'm sorry that you and your family are caught up in something that Glenn made happen. But I can't speak to you or Glenn outside of the formal process. I'm asking you both to leave my property." Glenn's pleasantness evaporated. Behind Karen's shoulder, his expression shifted into something harder and less managed. "You need to be careful, Vivian," he said. "Raymond did things that I protected him from. If you keep pushing this, everything comes out. Everything." I looked at him steadily. Everything, in this context, meant Raymond's involvement. It meant the threat of painting Raymond as the primary actor and Glenn as a reluctant participant. It was a reasonable threat in the sense that it had some factual grounding. Raymond had participated. Raymond had not been entirely a victim. "I understand," I said. "I've made peace with the fact that Raymond was not entirely who I thought he was. The court can sort out his portion of the responsibility along with yours. Goodbye, Glenn." I closed the door. Karen said something on the porch that I didn't quite catch. Then Glenn's voice, lower and tighter. Then the sound of them walking away and a car door and the engine and the street going quiet again. I stood in my hallway and took a breath and thought very clearly about what had just happened. Then I went to the kitchen and wrote down every word of the exchange with timestamps and called Sandra. She filed for a protective order the following morning and included documentation of both the phone call and the Saturday visit. The judge granted a no-contact provision within the week. Simone had come back by then to stay with me for a stretch. She was at the kitchen table when I got off the phone with Sandra, drinking tea, watching my face. "He threatened Dad's reputation," she said. Not a question. I told her yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad already damaged his own reputation. Glenn didn't give him that. I found that, unexpectedly, very settling to hear. There is a particular kind of loneliness in discovering that your late husband was not entirely the person you thought he was. It is different from the loneliness of grief, different from the loneliness of living alone in a house built for two. It sits in its own category, the loneliness of not being able to ask the questions you need answered, and of knowing that even if you could, the answers might only complicate things further. I joined an online forum for surviving spouses in similar situations, people who had found hidden accounts, undisclosed debts, financial arrangements their partners had kept private. I did not share details. I read, mostly. What I found was that the particular shame of not having known was almost universal, and that it lifted gradually when you understood that deception is a deliberate act, and that being deceived is not the same thing as being foolish. I also called my sister Renee, who lived in Victoria and who had never particularly liked Raymond, a fact she had managed gracefully for 27 years. She did not say, "I told you so." She said, "What do you need?" And I said I needed someone to talk to who wasn't involved in the legal proceedings. And she said she would call me every Sunday evening, which she did, for the next 8 months without missing once. The matter of Constance Yip's claim moved through Ontario's civil courts over the following months. I testified once, briefly and factually, about finding the documents and the steps I had taken to preserve them. Douglas had prepared me thoroughly. My testimony was, I think, unremarkable. I answered what I was asked. I volunteered nothing. I was calm. Glenn's defense presented the argument that Raymond had been the primary architect of the billing scheme and that Glenn's participation had been limited and reluctant. The email correspondence did not support this. There were 17 emails from Glenn's account directing specific invoice structures and, in 2 cases, instructing Raymond on how to code particular charges to make them harder to identify. Raymond's notarized letter, which the court admitted as a statement against his own interest, described Glenn's role in those early conversations in detail. There was a moment in the proceedings that I have thought about many times since. Glenn's own lawyer, attempting to establish that the billing irregularities had been Raymond's idea, asked Glenn to describe his reaction when Raymond first proposed the arrangement. Glenn gave an answer. It was careful and internally consistent, and it had the quality of something that had been rehearsed until it sounded natural. The opposing counsel, Douglas, waited until he finished, and then asked him to read aloud from the first email in Exhibit C, which was dated 5 months before the date Glenn had just described as the origin of the arrangement. Glenn read it. His voice stayed even, but something in his posture changed in a way that I suspect the judge noticed, because I noticed it from where I was sitting. The judge's written decision came in September. The court found that Glenn Sato's holding company had engaged in a fraudulent billing scheme in breach of its fiduciary duty to Constance Yip as a property management client and ordered restitution of $310,000 plus costs. The decision also included a note referring the matter to the Law Society of Ontario regarding Glenn's conduct, as he held a property management license with designated duties under provincial consumer protection legislation. Constance called me the afternoon the decision was released. Her voice on the phone was the same steadiness it had always been, but there was something else underneath it. "I'm glad," she said simply, "and I want you to know, what you did by telling me took something." "I imagine it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," I said. "Raymond did a wrong thing," she said, "and he tried to leave the means to fix it. That's complicated. I've been thinking about that." I had been thinking about it too, for months. I had made my peace with it imperfectly, the way you make peace with things that don't resolve cleanly. Raymond had stolen from her. He had also preserved the evidence that allowed her to recover what was taken. He had not disclosed it while he was alive. He had also not destroyed it when he easily could have. The accounting of who he was ran through both columns simultaneously, and I had stopped trying to resolve it into a single verdict. Glenn Sato did not make the full payment immediately. He attempted, through a new lawyer, to negotiate a payment schedule, arguing liquidity issues with the holding company. Douglas countered with a motion to have the company's assets frozen pending payment. Glenn paid within 30 days of the motion. The Law Society investigation concluded the following spring. Glenn Sato's property management license was suspended for 2 years, with conditions on reinstatement that included mandatory ethics training and a supervised audit of his remaining client accounts. It was not a permanent revocation, and Douglas, when he told me, said with careful neutrality that it was somewhat lighter than he had hoped. But it was public record. It was searchable. When anyone in the GTA looked up Glenn Sato's property management company, from that point forward, that record would be the third result. I thought about selling the house in Oakville in those months. Raymond and I had chosen it together, had painted every room ourselves, over a long August weekend the year we moved in. The kitchen still had the marks on the door frame, where we'd tracked Simone's height from age 4 to 12. I sat with the question for the full winter, the way Sandra had once advised me to sit with any decision that involved both money and grief. Separately first, then together. I didn't sell, not yet, but I rearranged it. I took Raymond's home office, which I had kept mostly untouched, and I turned it into something else. A reading room, with the desk replaced by a low chair by the window and the shelves restocked with books I had been meaning to read for years. I did not erase him from the house. I added myself to it. Simone and I had our hardest conversation that spring. She wanted to know, plainly, how I thought about her father now. We were sitting in the kitchen, which is where we always had the difficult conversations, as though the table provided some necessary grounding. I told her the truth, that I had gone back and forth, that there were days when the betrayal, both to me and to Constance, was what I felt most clearly, and other days when what I felt most clearly was the image of Raymond, 3 months before he died, sitting down to write a letter and put it in an envelope and tape it to a filing cabinet because he could not bring himself to say it out loud while he was alive, that neither of those things canceled the other out, that I expected I would be working out how I felt about Raymond Charbonneau-Doucet for some time yet, and that I had decided that was all right. Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought about him differently than she had expected to. Not worse, exactly, more completely. I understood that. A more complete picture is not always a better one, but it is closer to true, and I have always found truth easier to live with than the alternative, even when it costs more. The following autumn, I took a leave of absence from the accounting firm and spent 3 weeks in Cape Breton with Renee, who had driven out from Victoria, to meet me there. We walked along the Cabot Trail in the October light, the color that comes once a year and makes you feel that the world is making an effort. I did not talk about Raymond or Glenn or any of it except in passing. Renee listened to what I said and left the rest alone. I came back to Oakville in November, 1 year after Raymond's death. The reading room had plants in the window by then, a small collection I had been adding to since spring, the kind that do well in that particular northern light. I made coffee in the kitchen and sat at the table and thought about the year that had passed. I had not sought a dramatic ending. I had not wanted one. What I had wanted was something that could not be unchosen, something that would still be true no matter how tired I got or how much any of it cost. Constance Yip had her money back. Glenn Sato's conduct was on public record. The documents were sealed in an Ontario courthouse, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in a house that was, unmistakably, mine. Some years are not about gaining anything. They are about making sure you know the exact shape of what you already have and deciding deliberately what you want to carry forward. The plants in the window were small still. They needed time, so did I, but they were established, and so was I, and outside the November light was doing what November light does in Ontario, that late, low particular angle that makes everything look both colder and more clearly itself. I poured a second cup and kept sitting, and I let that be enough.